So today we're going to go through part 2 of our series on how to create a low-cost Azure Data Warehouse. In this video we'll be covering how to create the pipeline, how to create the trigger on the pipeline, and by the end of this demo we will have a process in place where we can upload CSVs to our storage account, and these SQL tables will be automatically populated. If you haven't already followed along with video 1, please go ahead and go through that video first because we went and set up all of the architecture that's needed for this demo. So part 1, step 1 of this process will be to go into the data factory, which as you can see I've got open here. And the first thing we're going to do is go to our author tab. And right here we've got pipelines. We're going to create a new pipeline. And you can name this pipeline anything you want. I'm just going to keep it as pipeline 1. First thing I'm going to do here is create a couple of parameters. The first being file name and the second being container. Now what these parameters are going to do is allow us to store the values of the file that we upload. So we're going to upload the file to a particular container, it's going to have a particular file name, and we're going to use these parameters to pass those values into various parts of our pipeline. The next thing we're going to do is add a trigger to this pipeline. And the type of trigger that we want is going to be a storage event. And what that means is this trigger will fire under a particular storage event, and when we configure it, you'll see that the storage event that we want is when a CSV is dropped into our container. So we can go ahead and pick the subscription that we created in the last video and the storage account, and we're just going to pick all containers under here. You could filter this to particular containers, but for our purposes, all containers is fine. I'm going to say that the blob path ends with .csv. That just means if you have any other files that you want to put in your storage account that you don't want to be pulled through, as long as they're not CSVs, this trigger will ignore them. And we're going to say that the blob is created, and that will fire the trigger. Now we do have 2 parameters here that we will need to fill in. The first file name parameter we're going to set to this value here, and what that does is when the trigger fires, it's going to pull the file name for us automatically from the storage account, and it's going to then allow us to put it into these parameters here. The second one is our container parameter, and very similarly we just want to pull the folder path for the file that's firing the trigger. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK there. The next thing we need to do is create a dataset, and these datasets are going to pull from the linked services that we created in the last video. So the first one needs to be pointing to our storage account, and we're going to go to Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. For this demo we're only focused on using CSVs, but as you can see we can have Excel files, JSON, XML, all these other different file formats. I'm going to select our linked service that we created last time, and we're going to leave everything else as is for now. Once we get to this stage, we can go to our parameters and create some new parameters here. The first will be file name, and the second will be container. And what that then means is when we go to our file path here, we can add some dynamic content, and we can say we're going to add the container parameter here and the file name parameter here. What that eventually will allow us to do is pull the file name and the container that the trigger provides into our pipeline via the pipeline parameters, and then into our dataset via these dataset parameters, and we'll set that up fully later on in the video. The next thing we're going to do is create another new dataset, and this one is going to be pointing to SQL. to our database that we created in the last video. So we want to go ahead and select Azure SQL Database. And then we're going to select the link service that we created last time. And we'll leave everything else blank for now. Similarly to the storage account dataset, we're going to set a parameter here. And we're going to just call this one table. And what that's going to allow us to do is we can enter the table name manually. For now, we're going to have the schema, just everything is going to go to the DBO schema. And the table name we're going to set to this table parameter. So now that our data sets are set up, we can go back to our pipeline and we're going to use a copy data activity. What this activity does, very simply, is it copies data from the source to the sink. So our source will be our delimited text data set that we just created. We're going to update the file name. And we're going to set that to the file name pipeline parameter that we created earlier. Similarly, we're going to add our container pipeline parameter into this dataset property. Then we can move on to our sink, and our sink we're going to set to our SQL dataset. And for the table name, we're going to set that to the container. Now the reason for that is what we can do in the storage account is we can set up separate containers for each table that we want to have in SQL, and then when we drop a particular file into a particular container, it will go to the table with the same name as the container. We need to configure a couple more things here. The first is we're going to say we want to auto create the table, and what that will do is when we upload a file into our container and it gets pushed into SQL, it will automatically create the table with the right fields and data types for us automatically. If you want to use existing, what you would need to do is to go into SQL and create those tables beforehand so that the data has somewhere to go. We're also going to add a pre-copy script here. And we're going to use this piece of code. Now what this is doing is it's taking the container name and inserting it into this string here, this drop table if exists. And all that means is if we already have data under that table name, or a table that already exists under that table name, we're going to drop it so that we can recreate it with the new data that comes in. So every time that we are uploading data to a particular table, we're wiping out that table beforehand and recreating it with the new data. Now in an upcoming video, I'll show you how to reconfigure that so that we can do an upsert or a merge of new data into existing data. But for now, to keep things simple, every time we upload new data, the old data will be completely removed. So that's our activity created and our data sets created. What we now need to do is update a few settings within Azure and within our SQL database to make sure that all of this has the right permissions. The first thing we need to do is to go and register an event grid resource provider. And to get there, what you need to do is to go to the subscription that you created in the previous video and then go to settings and resource providers. Once you're there, you can search for event grid. And you can see here I've already registered. By default, this will not be registered. So all you need to do is select it and hit register here. What having this resource provider registered allows is the trigger to fire based on events happening within the Azure storage account. So it's essential that this is turned on. Without it, the trigger won't work. The next thing we need to do is we need to update some SQL permissions. So I'm going to go into my SQL database and I've already logged into the query editor here. If you don't know how to get there, all you need to do is locate your SQL database and go to Create Editor on the left here and log in with your credentials. So I'm going to add 3 role permissions to my SQL database. All 3 of them will be pointing towards the managed identity that we created in our last video. And just to go back and find the details of that, all we need to do is go to our Manage tab, go to our Link Services, Azure SQL Database, and you can see here we've got our managed identity name. So I'm going to take that managed identity name, go back into my database, and I'm going to run 3 scripts. The first is I want to add the managed identity to the DDL admin role. And what that's going to allow is the managed identity can create and drop tables, which is essential for this pipeline. The second is I'm going to add the managed identity to the data reader role. And that's going to allow it to check to see if that table exists when it wants to drop it. And the final one I'm going to add is the DB data writer role. And what that's going to allow is the managed identity to actually insert the data into the table. So now that all 3 of those have run, we can go back to our data factory. Cancel that up here. And we're just going to double check that our trigger, it's started, it's turned on. Okay, so you may have to go in here and make sure that the trigger is started, but it looks like it has. And then we're going to go ahead and publish all of our changes. That's just going to save everything to Data Factory. At this point, once you've published, this trigger is then live. Anything that hasn't been published, even if it says that the trigger has started, the trigger isn't actually live yet. It's only things that have been published are live. So from this point on, any CSVs that are uploaded to our storage account will be processed by this trigger and by our pipeline. So now that that's all been published, what we can do is go to our storage account. And I've opened this up already, but all you need to do is locate your storage account, go to Data Storage and Containers. And you can see here, this is the storage account we created in the last video. We don't have any containers created yet. So we can go ahead and create a very simple container. For now, I'll just call this demo container 1. We can open up that container. And once we've opened up that container, we can then upload a CSV. I just have a CSV of some weather data that I got from a public source. So I'm going to go ahead and upload that now. That's uploaded successfully. Go back to our data factory and we want to then go to the monitor tab. And what we can see is that pipeline has already started. If we click on the pipeline name, we can see the detail of what's happening here. And if we just periodically refresh that, we can now see that that's in progress. Click on the glasses tab, we can actually see as the data is going through. This one went very quickly, it's a very small file, but if it was a larger file, you could see the progress of this loading in. And we can see that pipeline is now run successfully. So the last thing we need to do is to go back into our SQL database. And if we open up our tables here, we can see we now have this table that's got the same name as the container that we created before. We can select the rows in there, and we can see that it's populated with data. So if you were to create another container with another name, drop a file in there, the pipeline would run again with a new pipeline run, and a new table would be created with the same container name.